Welcome to this deep dive. We are plunging deep into the history, culture, and the dynamic modern landscape of the Dominican Republic.
Yeah, and we've got a really fascinating collection of articles and research that you've pulled together here that's basically going to be our guide for this exploration.
Right. Our mission is pretty simple. Just unpack all this information, pull out the most important insights, maybe some surprising facts too, and give you a real shortcut to understanding this vibrant Caribbean nation.
And it's quite a sweep of time we're covering.
It really is. We're going to go from its earliest inhabitants, way back, right up to the challenges and triumphs happening today.
It's definitely a history full of pivotal moments, lots of layers, lots of influences. So where should we start?
Okay, maybe let's set the scene first. Geography. Where exactly are we talking about on the map?
Okay, so we're looking at the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean. The Dominican Republic takes up the eastern two-thirds, roughly.
And it shares the island with Haiti.
That's right. Haiti's on the western side. And size-wise, the numbers you provided say it's about 48,442 square kilometers, so a decent size.
And the landscape, it's not just flat beaches, is it? The sources paint a picture of, well, incredible diversity.
Absolutely. You get everything. There are mountains like Pico Duarte, that's the highest peak in the entire Caribbean, over 3,000 meters.
Wow.
Yeah. And then you have fertile valleys, plains, and of course, extensive coastlines on both the Atlantic and the Caribbean sides.
And the biodiversity sounds amazing, too.
It does. The material mentions over 450 native plant species, more than 150 bird and mammal species. It's really rich ecologically.
So getting around, the sources suggest, is pretty doable.
It seems that way. They talk about major international airports, a national taxi service. There's also an extensive bus system that sounds quite efficient and apparently affordable for getting between cities.
Ferries, too?
Yeah, smaller ferries connecting some coastal spots. So the infrastructure seems quite developed for travel.
All right, so let's picture this land before the Europeans arrived. Who was living there? Who did Columbus meet?
Well, the sources primarily identify the Taínos as the main indigenous group the Spanish encountered first.
Okay. And what was their life like?
They lived a subsistence lifestyle, mostly agriculture. They were organized into these matrilineal clans led by a chief, a cacique.
Right, I saw that term.
And they also had a kind of spiritual leader or healer figure called a bohique.
And their language. It's kind of amazing how much of it is still with us today. That really struck me in the material.
It's one of the most fascinating takeaways, isn't it? The sheer number of words we still use that come directly from Taíno, it's remarkable.
Like what? What are some examples?
Oh, the sources list tons of maize for corn, guanabana, the fruit, iguana, hammock, hurricane, barracuda, and so many names for local plants, animals, places. It really shows this linguistic persistence despite everything that happened later.
But the way the Europeans even named them shows a power imbalance right from the beginning, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Calling them Indios, because Columbus thought he was in Asia, that was the first layer.
A massive geographical mistake.
Right. But the sources also point out that terms we might use now, like Aborigines or indigenous, were still labels applied by the colonizers. And what's really insightful, I think, is the note that the Taíno language itself didn't really have concepts like nation or native in the way Europeans understood them.
So the act of naming was itself a form of control.
Exactly.
Yeah.
As the material suggests, naming and defining can be tools of power, even violence, in that kind of context.
And were the Taíno the very first people there? Or does the history go back even further?
It seems it goes back further. The research you provided indicates evidence of earlier groups on Hispaniola, possibly thousands of years before the Taíno.
And they might have coexisted.
Yeah, potentially coexisting for centuries. These earlier people likely migrated from around Panama. The broader group, the Arawak peoples, which includes the Taíno, developed more complex societies than some others in the region. Agriculture, crafts, pretty sophisticated cosmology.
So the Taíno themselves, they had a structured society. Hierarchies, religion.
They definitely did. The sources talk about a hierarchy with regional chiefs overseeing local groups, and they had a distinct religious cult with priests and idols, zemis.
And they were generally peaceful compared to others nearby.
They're often characterized that way, yeah, especially compared to the neighboring Caribs. They apparently called their island Quisqué, or Bohio, which meant something like Island of the Huts, skilled farmers too.
But then 1492 happens.
Yeah.
And their story becomes incredibly tragic.
It's just a devastating part of the history laid out in this material. The Taíno population estimates vary, but maybe around 40,000 at its peak, it just plummeted incredibly quickly after the Europeans arrived.
Why? What caused such a rapid decline?
It was a combination of brutal factors highlighted in the sources: outright violence, enslavement, their lack of immunity to European diseases like smallpox.
Right. Disease was huge.
Massive. And then there was the encomienda system.
Explain that a bit.
Basically, the Spanish crown granted settlers rights over Taíno land and, crucially, their labor. It was essentially forced labor, working them to death in gold mines and on the very first sugar plantations.
Yes, horrific exploitation.
Absolutely. The material even mentions one source claiming there might be just one tiny remaining community near the mouth of the Rio Una, which just underscores the almost total collapse of the population.
And that collapse, the loss of the Taíno population as a labor source, that fundamentally changed everything for the island, didn't it?
It absolutely did. It's a crucial turning point shown in the sources. Because the Taíno labor force disappeared, the Spanish needed workers for the sugar industry they were trying to build,
which led directly to
the large-scale importation of enslaved Africans. That became the new foundation of the colonial economy.
And Hispaniola itself, the island, it became strategically vital for Spain.
Hugely important. It served as what the material calls a springboard for Spain's conquests across the Americas.
Like a base of operations.
Exactly. For pushing into the rest of the Caribbean, Central and South America, even parts of North America.
But Spain didn't have Hispaniola all to themselves, did they? Other European powers started eyeing it.
No, they definitely faced challenges. The sources mention contestation from English, French, and Dutch fleets, often privateers early on.
And the French were particularly successful.
They were. They managed to establish firm control over the western part of the island. That became Saint-Domingue.
Which became incredibly wealthy.
Fabulously wealthy, yeah. But based on the most brutal form of slave labor imaginable, producing huge amounts of coffee, cotton, and especially sugar. And the French invested heavily there. Ports, cities.
And the sources draw a key contrast here with the Spanish part, right?
Yes, it's a really important point. While Saint-Domingue was booming, the sources say the Spanish kind of neglected the eastern part, what would become the Dominican Republic. They focused their resources elsewhere in their empire on more lucrative trade routes.
So the eastern part remained more agricultural, less developed.
Pretty much. Less investment, less focus. And this difference, this neglect, eventually started to create tension among the Spanish Creoles living there.
Leading to revolts.
Exactly. The material mentions a local government being declared in the East in 1821. José Núñez de Cáceres led it, trying to break away from Spain.
How long did that last?
Not long at all. Only about 60 days, according to the sources. It was very short-lived.
Okay, so that brief attempt at self-rule, it leads us right into a really defining period for the eastern part of Hispaniola, the time under Haitian rule.
Right. So Haiti gained its independence from France in 1804, a huge event. Then, from 1822 to 1844, the entire island was unified under Haitian rule.
Under President Jean-Pierre Boyer.
Correct. And Boyer did implement some significant changes in the East.
Like abolishing slavery.
Yes, he abolished slavery there, which was obviously huge. He also tried to set up public schools, rebuild some towns. But the sources emphasize that his overall governance was seen as really repressive by the Dominicans in the East. He dissolved their local autonomy, imposed military rule.
And that created resentment.
A lot of resentment. It really fueled the desire for their own independence and laid the groundwork for the movement against Haitian authorities. Elite Dominicans started organizing.
And figures like Juan Pablo Duarte emerged as leaders.
Duarte is absolutely key. He formed that secret society, La Trinitaria, specifically to work towards independence.
Which they finally declared when?
February 27th, 1844. That's the Dominican Independence Day. But it wasn't the end of the fighting. It kicked off the War of Independence, which lasted until 1856, because Haiti kept trying to regain control.
And they adopted these powerful ideals, la libertad, freedom, la independencia, put the cross on their flag.
They did. And they drafted a constitution apparently based on the U.S. model, promising liberties.
Well, did it stick?
Unfortunately, the sources call it a mere paper tiger. Despite the ideals, despotic, authoritarian rule came back pretty quickly.
So independence didn't exactly mean stability.
Far from it. The post-independence period was really challenging. One major fear, according to the sources, was actually being re-annexed by Spain.
Even though they just fought for independence.
Well, yes. But there was also this growing sense of distinct Dominican identity, different from the Haitians, but maybe also unsure about complete independence. And that fear of Spain wasn't unfounded.
Because it actually happened.
It did, yeah. In 1861, the president at the time, General Pedro Santana, facing a lot of internal instability, actually annexed the country back to Spain.
Wow. How did Dominicans react to that?
Not, well, generally. It sparked another war, the Dominican Restoration War, from 1861 to 1865.
And who led the fight against the Spanish this time?
The material highlights General Santiago Rodriguez. His victory at the Battle of Santiago was apparently a crucial turning point. It led to them proclaiming liberty again and getting rid of Santana's pro-Spanish government.
It sounds like there was already a strong anti-Spanish sentiment.
The sources suggest that, yeah, a historical dislike for Spanish rule going back, citing perceived misrule and demands for tribute. There was a strong desire for local autonomy and control over their own products.
Okay, let's move into the 20th century.
Yeah.
The sources really dive into a period dominated by, well, dictatorship.
Yeah.
And this continuing issue of anti-Haitianismo.
Right. But before we get to Trujillo, it's interesting what the sources note about social conditions before the big 20th century events. Back in the late colonial era,
Yeah.
the population was already a mix: whites, free people of color, enslaved people. But apparently by the late 18th century, claiming to have whiter roots was actually seen as kind of offensive. Many people were just categorized broadly as Negroes.
Interesting social dynamic there. But then came the regime that really cast a long shadow.
Yeah, the Trujillo dictatorship. Started in 1930. Rafael Leonidas Trujillo Molina, they called him Little Beard,
And his rule was
ruthlessly authoritarian. The sources describe extreme violence against any perceived opponents: politicians, union leaders, activists, even priests, and tragically, the Mirabal sisters.
a very famous case. He had a secret police force, alliances.
Oh yeah, secret police, strong control. He allied himself with the Catholic Church too. And critically, the sources highlight how he built part of his popularity on campaigns specifically against Haitians.
Which leads to that horrific event, the Parsley Massacre.
Yes, 1937. It just underscores the brutality of the regime and the racial hatred he fostered.
What exactly happened?
Trujillo ordered the systematic murder of black peasants living along the border. It specifically targeted Dominicans of Haitian descent and any Haitians still residing there.
Numbers are staggering.
They are. The sources estimate somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 people were slaughtered. And the detail about the parsley.
Because they couldn't pronounce the Spanish word perejil, correct?
That's the reported justification, yes. It's incredibly chilling. And the sources make it crystal clear. This event cemented a racial animosity that has tragically echoed right into the modern era.
How did the dictatorship finally end?
He was assassinated in June 1961.
And did things get better immediately?
Well, it opened up a brief window of liberalization. Juan Bosch was elected president in 1962. He represented a more reformist path, but he was ousted in a military coup just a year later in 1963.
So more instability.
Exactly, and that instability plunged the country right back into conflict, the Civil War of 1965.
What sparked that?
It was sparked by the brutal killing of students who were protesting, demanding Bosch's return. This was in April '65. Constitutionalist factions formed, trying to restore the democratic government and push out pro-U.S. military figures.
Exiles got involved too.
Yeah, the sources mentioned Dominican exiles, including many based in Puerto Rico, joining the fight on the constitutionalist side.
And the U.S. played a significant role here.
A very significant role. U.S. forces intervened and occupied the country.
Why? What was their reasoning?
Officially, they said it was to protect U.S. citizens, but the sources indicate it effectively stopped the constitutionalists from bringing Bosch back to power.
And the outcome?
It led to about 5 years of a U.S.-backed democracy, but according to the material, violence returned, and it worsened an already existing economic crisis.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and look at the modern Dominican Republic. Based on the sources, what's driving the economy today?
The picture painted is an economy largely powered by a few key sectors: free trade zones, or FTZs, tourism, construction, agriculture, and foreign investment.
Those free trade zones, they sound really central. The sources mentioned something about capturing cheap labor.
Yeah, they're basically special areas set up with laws designed to attract foreign companies, offering things like big tax breaks.
Like for garment factories.
Exactly. The sources position the DR as a prime example of an economy that captures what they call a stagnant flow of economic migration by cheap labor. One specific law, Ley 890, gave huge tax breaks to garment factories and apparently caused an explosion of these zones back in the 80s. It really reshaped the economy.
And tourism has also just boomed, right?
Dramatically. The government started showing interest back in '67, but by 1999, the sources say they had over 3 million tourists a year.
But there's a catch mentioned about the money.
Yeah, it's a crucial point raised in the material. The popularity of all-inclusive resorts means many tourists stay within that bubble. Very little of their spending actually filters into the broader local economy.
They cite a number.
An average of just $34.50 a day spent locally per tourist, which isn't much.
Are there efforts to change that?
The sources say yes. There are efforts to diversify tourism beyond just the big resorts, and incentives for private investment in other kinds of tourism experiences. The DR is definitely a major recipient of foreign direct investment in tourism, though. Punta Cana is highlighted as a quintessential asset.
Okay, what about agriculture? Still important?
Still a major export sector, yes. Historically, sugar was king, sometimes up to 2/3 of agricultural exports.
But other things too.
Oh, yeah. Tobacco, bananas, rice, cocoa, coffee are all mentioned as significant. The main markets are the U.S., Europe, and Puerto Rico.
What are the challenges facing farming now?
Well, the sources point to difficulties in staying competitive, especially with sugar. There's a constant need to diversify away from relying so heavily on it.
Does it help with poverty?
Growth in agricultural exports has helped reduce rural poverty, according to the material. But threats remain like diminishing land availability and a lack of sustainable programs to support farmers long term.
And foreign investment, it sounds like it has a long, maybe complicated history there.
It definitely does. The material traces it way back, including serious debt problems under President Ulysses Chirot in the late 19th century. That led to deals where national assets like railways and ports were basically used as collateral.
And U.S. investment grew significantly.
Hugely, especially in sugar plantations and infrastructure like ports and railways. Under Trujillo, U.S. investment reportedly topped $300 million. The sources actually describe the DR as becoming practically a U.S. protectorate during that time.
And is foreign investment still key today?
It seems so. The sources suggest that a continued lack of significant local capital means there's still a lot of room, and perhaps reliance, on foreign investment.
Let's switch over to culture now. It's always described as this really rich mix.
It truly is. You really see the blend of the Taíno roots, the Spanish colonial influence, and the deep African ancestry.
But the sources talk about a complex relationship with the Taíno part of that identity today.
Yeah, it's fascinating. There's apparently this lingering idea that, well, if you speak Spanish, you can't really be Taíno. And the dominant historical narrative for a long time was one of Taíno extinction.
But people want to connect with and celebrate those roots now, alongside the African and European heritage.
Exactly. The sources really emphasize this call for a critical re-examination of that old extinction narrative. They talk about building cultural respect that fully embraces the complex hybrid identity that actually exists.
And nowhere does that hybridity seem more vibrant than in the music and dance.
Oh, absolutely. The material really brings this to life. It highlights this incredibly rich musical heritage, drawing from African traditions, Spanish influences, even some Middle Eastern threads, plus influence from Caribbean neighbors.
Merengue is the big one, right?
It's iconic. It's even got UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage status now. Its origins might be linked to slavery, evolving from rural styles typico with accordion and tambora drum into city styles with horns, and later fusing into things like meringue pop.
And then there's bachata. That's huge internationally now.
It really is. It's considered the national genre now, alongside meringue. But it started very differently.
How so?
It came from working-class rural roots. The themes were often about heartbreak, despair, being on the margins, and it was initially kind of looked down upon by the upper classes.
But it spread.
Yeah, during the urban construction boom, people moving from the countryside brought bachata with them. Then technology recordings, radio helped it gain popularity, eventually exploding internationally. So now, as the sources nicely put it, merengue and bachata dance the same floor. Both are nationally celebrated.
The DR also has the distinction of having the first university in the Americas, right?
That's correct. Santo Tomás de Aquino in Santo Domingo, founded way back in 1538. The sources mention its early focus on theology and trace how intellectual life developed, often tied to institutions and associations over the centuries.
And the food sounds like another delicious fusion.
Absolutely. It's described as a real melting pot Taíno ingredients, African techniques, Spanish dishes, French touches, even some North American influences creeping in.
What kind of food is popular?
Dominicans seem to enjoy big meals. The sources list things like different kinds of salami congre, chiquito fried cheese, lots of plantains and bananas prepared in various ways like quillet.
And the sources mention a kind of casualness around meals, eating with fingers, spontaneous invites.
Yeah, it paints a picture of maybe a more relaxed communal dining culture compared to some others.
Architecture, too, seems to tell that layered story.
It does. You see a mix of styles reflecting indigenous, colonial, and modern periods. They use traditional materials alongside modern ones. The colonial zone in Santo Domingo is obviously a huge landmark.
Because it has all the firsts.
Exactly. The first cathedral, the first hospital, that first university, the first colonial administration building, the first fortifications in the Americas are all there. It's now a remodeled, revitalized area with shops and restaurants.
Okay, finally, we really have to address the continuation of anti-Haitianismo and other social issues in the modern era. The sources cover this quite extensively.
Yeah, this is a really challenging but absolutely critical part of understanding the DR today. That historical anti-Haitian nationalism, deeply scarred by things like the 1937 massacre, well, the sources make it clear it continues to have a lasting impact.
And there are modern examples of this discrimination.
Stark examples. The material mentions a really disturbing incident from 1983 where a Haitian girl apparently had her hair cut in school as a punishment, essentially for being Haitian.
Wow. And this isn't just history, it's ongoing.
Discrimination is described as still being prevalent today, and it's often tied up with socioeconomic status. The sources suggest a pattern where Dominicans of European descent might disproportionately hold upper and middle-class positions, while Haitians and Dominicans of Haitian descent are often found in lower-paid, sometimes undesirable jobs.
And this has a direct impact on citizenship, right, for people of Haitian descent.
It's a massive issue. Many Haitians, and even Dominicans born in the DR, but of Haitian parentage, face immense hurdles getting citizenship. Language barriers, wealth disparity, sheer discrimination, it all plays a role, even if they've lived and worked there for decades.
The sources use strong language, calling it a land of oppression for some.
They did, and that situation seems to have gotten much worse after a specific court ruling in 2013.
What did that ruling do?
It was devastating. It effectively reassessed the citizenship status of potentially hundreds of thousands of people of Haitian background, even those born and raised in the DR whose parents might have been undocumented. It rendered an estimated 300,000 people stateless overnight.
And led to deportation.
The mass expulsions, yeah, and widespread fear, arbitrary enforcement. It created a huge human rights crisis.
Are there other major social issues highlighted in the material?
Yes. The sources also point to significant challenges in the education system. They describe haphazard schooling, particularly in places like Santo Domingo.
What does that mean, haphazard?
It links poor quality to things like excessive school fees families can't afford, kids having to work instead of going to school, and just a general failure of the system to advance learning effectively for many.
And that creates problems for the economy, too.
Yeah, it contributes to a gap between the skills needed for the jobs available, especially in those FTZs and tourism, and the education level of the workforce. Education reform efforts are mentioned as ongoing, though.
Anything else? Crime.
The sources do touch on concerns about violent crime, referencing a somewhat complex description linked to political crises and street situations. However, they also contrast this with a perceived sense of safety during community events like festivals or horse races. So it's a bit nuanced.
Wow. Okay. We have covered an incredible amount of ground in this deep dive into the Dominican Republic. I mean, from the very earliest peepers right through to modern economic drivers and these really complex social challenges.
It really is a story that's incredibly layered, isn't it? You have the tragic encounter with the Europeans, the whole complexity of colonization and the sugar economy, that difficult, long struggle for independence, which was so marked by tensions with Haiti.
Then the long, dark period of the Trujillo dictatorship.
Right. And now these ongoing dynamic efforts in economic development, but also in cultural expression today. It's a lot.
And that cultural fusion, that blend of Taíno, African, and European roots, It really does seem to shine through,
Ah.
especially as the sources described in the music, the dance, the food, the art.
Definitely vibrant. Yet you can't ignore the enduring challenges, that intricate, often fraught relationship with Haiti, and these significant internal social issues like citizenship and education. They remain absolutely central to the modern Dominican story presented here.
So this deep dive, really digging into the material you provided, was all about giving you, our listener, that targeted shortcut, a way to grasp these intricate layers and maybe some surprising facts about the Dominican Republic.
There's certainly a lot to process from this history just based on these sources alone.
Definitely. So as we wrap up, maybe here's a thought to carry with you, something stemming directly from what we've unpacked today. Given that the sources consistently highlight this historical tendency within the Dominican Republic, a tendency to minimize, or sometimes even deny, the indigenous and African parts of its heritage in favor of a national narrative centered more on Spanish whiteness, how does a nation actually grapple with that? How does it reconcile and maybe even heal from such a complex and at times deeply painful history to build a genuinely inclusive identity for everyone in its future?